Part 1 had worked for the Galactic Council's Cultural Documentation Bureau for 347 cycles. In that time, they had the celebrations of over 2,000 species. They had watched the eye fill their oceans with bioluminescent displays during their Festival of Deep Light. They had recorded the merchant guilds as they counted their fortunes in massive public ceremonies that lasted for weeks. They had even documented the monuments of Tau, those strange silicon-based beings who celebrated by simply existing more intensely for a few days before returning to their normal state. Had seen it all, or so they believed. The crystalline archivist floated through the corridors of Documentation Station 12, their body catching the light and scattering it into rainbows across the walls. Their form was made of living crystal, grown over centuries into a shape that was vaguely humanoid but clearly alien. Light passed through them and emerged changed, carrying information in its new patterns. This was how thought communicated and recorded their observations. Today, a new assignment waited in their office. A species called humanity had recently joined the galactic community. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 40 cycles ago, making them one of the youngest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. The Bureau needed someone to document their cultural celebrations for the Universal Celebration Index. Accepted the assignment without much thought. Young species rarely surprised them anymore. Most celebrations fell into predictable categories: harvest festivals, coming-of-age ceremonies, religious observances tied to astronomical events. The patterns repeated across thousands of worlds because they grew from universal needs. Every species needed to mark the passage of time, the transition from child to adult, the gathering of resources. The archivist reviewed the preliminary files on humanity. They were carbon-based, soft-bodied, and remarkably fragile compared to most species. They had evolved on a small rocky planet orbiting a yellow star. Their civilization was barely 10,000 cycles old. They had spent most of that time fighting among themselves before finally achieving some measure of unity. Nothing in the files suggested anything unusual about their celebrations. Traveled to the human colony on 442b, a world that humanity had terraformed into something resembling there. The colony was called New Boston, and it held approximately 50,000 human residents along with a small population of other species who had come for trade or diplomacy. The archivist arrived during what the local calendar called October. They had arranged to observe a cultural event called a Halloween party, which their preliminary research indicated was some form of harvest festival with religious overtones. The description mentioned costumes, which understood to mean ceremonial garments worn for specific purposes. They expected robes, perhaps masks with symbolic meanings, maybe body paint applied in traditional patterns. The party was held in a large building that the humans called a community center, floated through the entrance and stopped immediately. Their crystalline body flickered with confusion, scattering light in erratic patterns across the walls. A human approached them wearing what appeared to be a crystalline body. It was not real, of course. It was made of plastic and glass and small battery-powered lights that blinked in patterns that meant nothing at all. The costume was crude and inaccurate in a dozen different ways. Species did not have faces, yet this costume had a smiling face painted on its central mass. The proportions were wrong. The colors were too bright. "Great costume," the human said cheerfully. "Are you supposed to be one of those crystal aliens? The detail is amazing. How did you get the light effects to work like that?" Did not know how to respond. They were not wearing a costume. They were a crystalline. This was simply their body. Before they could formulate a reply, another human walked past. This one appeared to be dressed as a large red fruit with a face. Behind them came a human who seemed to be covered in blood, though closer observation revealed it was merely colored syrup. Then came a human dressed in clothing from what the archivist recognized as a previous century of human history. Then a human dressed as an animal. then a human dressed as a fictional character from human entertainment media. Then most confusingly of all, a human dressed as what they called a sexy asteroid. Had no framework for understanding what they were observing. They recorded everything, their crystalline body processing and storing the visual information automatically, but they could not categorize it. This was not a harvest festival. This was not a religious ceremony. This was not any form of celebration they had encountered in 347 cycles of documentation work. They spent the entire evening floating through the party, watching and recording. Humans ate food that had been made to look like internal organs. They drank beverages colored to resemble blood. They danced to music that seemed designed to evoke fear. Children ran through the crowd collecting small packages of sugar. One human explained the history of the celebration too. Apparently, it had originated as a religious observance thousands of cycles ago, marking a night when the barrier between the living and the dead was believed to be thin. Over time, it had evolved into something else entirely. The religious elements had faded. What remained was the practice of wearing costumes and pretending to be something other than oneself. But why? Asked. The human seemed confused by the question. Because it's fun, they said. You get to be someone else for a night or something else. Whatever you want, really. This answer only raised more questions. Returned to the documentation station and began their preliminary report. As they worked, they discovered something troubling. Halloween was not an isolated phenomenon. Humans held costume parties for many different occasions. They dressed in clothing from previous decades and called it a decade's party. They dressed as characters from murder mysteries and acted out fictional crimes. They wrapped themselves in sheets and called it a toga party. They wore deliberately ugly clothing and called it an ugly sweater party. The categories seemed endless. Costume balls, masquerades, theme parties, cosplay conventions, Renaissance fairs, historical reenactments. Each one required participants to dress as something or someone they were not. Searched the Universal Celebration Index for comparable practices among other species. They found nothing. The eye decorated their environments for festivals, but did not decorate themselves. The merchant guilds wore their finest garments to celebrate wealth, but did not pretend to be something other than themselves. The monuments simply changed the intensity of their existence. No species in the index had ever developed the practice of wearing costumes to celebrations. The archivists checked their research 3 times. They expanded their search to include extinct species, newly contacted species, even species that had been briefly observed but never officially contacted. Nothing. The practice appeared to be unique to humanity. This was unexpected. Flagged the research for review by the Bureau's senior analysts. They attached their recordings from the Halloween party, along with supplementary materials about other human costume celebrations. They noted that the practice appeared to be widespread across human cultures, suggesting it was not an isolated development, but rather something fundamental to the species. The response came faster than expected. The Bureau was dispatching a full research team to Earth and its colonies, was being promoted to lead researcher on the project. The Universal Celebration Index had no existing category for what humans appeared to be doing, and the Bureau needed to understand it before they could properly document it. Accepted the new assignment with a feeling they had not experienced in over 100 cycles. It took them several moments to identify it. Curiosity. Genuine, unfiltered curiosity. They had believed they had seen everything the galaxy had to offer in terms of celebrations. They had been wrong. Somewhere on a small rocky planet orbiting a yellow star, a young species had invented something new. Something that 12,000 cycles of galactic civilization had never produced. Something that did not understand at all. They needed to learn more. The research team assembled within 3 days. 12 specialists from 8 different species, all experts in cultural documentation, briefed them on the preliminary findings, showed them the recordings from the Halloween party, explained the scope of what they were investigating. When they finished, the room was silent. Finally, one of the researchers spoke. "They pretend to be things they are not," they said slowly, "for entertainment purposes, with no religious or ceremonial requirement." "Correct," he confirmed. "And they find this enjoyable." "They appear to find it extremely enjoyable." The researcher made a sound that indicated profound confusion. But why would anyone want to be something other than themselves? Scattered light across the room in patterns that conveyed uncertainty. "That," they said, "is what we need to find out." Part 2. The research team arrived on Earth during what humans called summer. The planet was smaller than had expected, a pale blue marble hanging in the darkness of space. Its single moon seemed oversized for such a modest world. The sun that warmed it was ordinary in every measurable way. Nothing about this system suggested it would produce anything remarkable. Yet here they were, investigating something that had never appeared anywhere else in recorded galactic history. The team established their base of operations in a human city called London. It was old by human standards, having existed for nearly 2,000 cycles. Humans seemed particularly attached to old places. They built new structures around ancient ones rather than replacing them. They celebrated the past even as they rushed toward the future. Noted this observation in their research files. It might be relevant. The investigation began with interviews. Human cultural experts explained the history of costume practices in human society. The tradition extended far back into human prehistory. Ancient humans had worn animal skins and masks during hunting rituals. They had dressed as gods and spirits during religious ceremonies. They had painted their bodies and worn elaborate headdresses to mark important occasions. This was not unusual. Many species had similar practices in their early development. What made humans different was what happened next. As human civilization advanced, the practice of wearing costumes did not fade away. Instead, it evolved. Religious ceremonies became theatrical performances. Theatrical performances became entertainment. Entertainment became recreation. The practice of pretending to be something other than oneself moved from the temple to the stage to the living room. Other species had abandoned such practices as they developed more sophisticated forms of expression. Humans had kept them and expanded them. They had invented new reasons to wear costumes. They had created entire industries around the production of costumes. They had built massive gathering places where thousands of humans came together to dress as fictional characters. The research team visited one of these gathering places. It was called a comic convention, and it was held in a massive building in a city called San. Had never seen anything like it. Thousands of humans filled the building, and most of them were wearing costumes. They dressed as characters from human entertainment media, heroes and villains from stories, creatures from mythology, robots and aliens and monsters. Some costumes were simple, put together from ordinary clothing and basic accessories. Others were elaborate constructions that must have taken months to create. The team observed a human dressed in a mechanical suit that stood 3 meters tall. They watched another human whose costume included functioning lights, sounds, and moving parts. They documented a group of humans who had coordinated their costumes to represent an entire cast of characters from a single story. "Why?" one of the researchers asked a passing human. "Why do you do this?" The human, dressed as a green-skinned character from a science fiction program, looked confused. "Because I love this character," they said. "When I wear this costume, I get to be them for a while. I get to feel what it might be like to be someone else. Someone braver or stronger or more interesting than I am in regular life." The researcher recorded this response, but clearly did not understand it. The team continued their observations. They attended birthday parties where children dressed as fictional princesses and superheroes. They visited historical reenactment societies, where adults dressed in clothing from centuries past and pretended to fight ancient battles. They observed murder mystery dinners where guests dressed as characters and acted out fictional crimes. They documented decades parties, toga parties, costume balls, masquerades, and theme events of every description. Everywhere they looked, humans were pretending to be things they were not. The research team struggled to categorize what they were observing. The Universal Celebration Index had classifications for every known form of festivity: religious ceremonies, agricultural festivals, coming-of-age rituals, commemorations of historical events, seasonal celebrations, family gatherings. None of these categories fit what humans were doing. A religious ceremony required belief in something greater than oneself. A costume party required only a desire to be something other than oneself. An agricultural festival celebrated abundance and thanked nature for its gifts. A themed party celebrated nothing except the joy of pretending. A coming-of-age ritual marked a permanent transition from one life stage to another. A costume could be put on and taken off at will, allowing a human to be a monster for one night and return to their normal life the next morning. Worked through the night, attempting to create a new classification system that could accommodate what they were observing. They consulted with researchers who specialized in the psychology of play. They reviewed studies of child development in human populations. They analyzed the chemical changes that occurred in human brains when they engaged in pretend activities. The answer, when it finally came, was surprisingly simple. Humans had retained their capacity for imaginative play into adulthood. Most species outgrew such behavior. Children of many species engaged in pretend activities as a way of learning social roles and practicing skills. But as they matured, these behaviors faded. Adult members of other species did not pretend to be things they were not. They had no need for such activities. Their identities were fixed, their roles in society were clear, and imagination served no practical purpose in their daily lives. Humans were different. Their capacity for imagination did not diminish with age. If anything, it grew stronger. Adult humans told stories, created art, and built entire fictional worlds in their minds. They experienced genuine emotions while watching fictional events. They formed attachments to characters who did not exist. And they dressed up as those characters because it allowed them to experience, however briefly, what it might feel like to be someone else. The research team reconvened to discuss their findings. The implications were significant. Humanity had developed a form of celebration that required a specific psychological capability, a capability that most species did not possess or had lost somewhere in their evolutionary development. "We need to create a new category in the index," announced. "There is no existing classification that can accommodate this practice." The senior analysts agreed. They proposed calling it Transformative Identity Celebration. The definition would read, "A form of festivity in which participants temporarily adopt alternate identities, personas, or aesthetic presentations for the purpose of enhanced enjoyment and social bonding." It was unprecedented. In 12,000 cycles of celebrations from 10,000 species, no one had ever needed to create an entirely new category. Every celebration that any species had ever invented had fit into existing classifications. Humanity had invented something genuinely new. The Bureau prepared to submit their findings to the Galactic Council. The report would credit humanity with inventing transformative identity celebration. It would note that the practice required psychological capabilities that appeared to be rare or unique in the known galaxy. It would recommend that other species study human costume practices to determine whether similar activities could be adopted. Before the report was submitted, requested permission to conduct one final observation. They wanted to attend a Halloween party again, now that they understood what they were observing. They wanted to experience it with new eyes. Permission was granted. returned to the human colony on 442b. October had come around again, and the colonists were preparing their celebration. This time, the archivist watched with understanding. A human child dressed as a monster ran past, pretending to frighten her friends. She was practicing what it felt like to be scary, to have power over others. Tomorrow she would return to being a small child in a world controlled by adults. Tonight, she could be something else. A human adult dressed as a historical figure stood by the refreshment table, explaining his costume to anyone who would listen. He was a scholar of history, fascinated by people who had lived long before him. The costume allowed him to feel connected to those people in a way that reading about them never could. A human couple wore matching costumes, dressed as characters from a love story they both enjoyed. The costumes announced their shared interests to the world. They had found each other, in part, through their common love of this story. The costumes celebrated that connection. Understood now. Costume parties were not about hiding from oneself. They were about exploring oneself. They allowed humans to try on different identities, different capabilities, different ways of being in the world. The costume was a tool for imagination, a gateway to experiences that normal life did not permit. The archivist recorded their observations and prepared to return to the documentation station. As they floated toward the exit, a human child approached them. "What are you supposed to be?" the child asked. Considered the question. They were a crystalline. They were a senior archivist with the Cultural Documentation Bureau. They were a researcher who had just helped discover something new about the galaxy. "I am myself," they said. The child frowned. "That's not a costume." "No," agreed, "but I am beginning to understand why you might want one." Part 3. The Bureau's report spread through the galactic community like light spreading through crystal. Within days, every major species had received copies of the findings. Within weeks, cultural researchers from 100 worlds were requesting access to the primary documentation. Within 3 cycles, the entire known galaxy was talking about humanity and their strange practice of dressing up as things they were not. The response was mixed. Some species dismissed the practice as primitive. The Eye, those ancient beings of bioluminescence and deep water, issued a formal statement noting that they had no need for such activities. Their celebrations focused on the collective expression of their species, not on individual transformation. Why would anyone want to be something other than an Eye, they asked. The Eye were perfect as they were. The merchant guilds have expressed concern about the economic implications. Costumes required materials, labor, and distribution networks. Who would control these new markets? Who would profit from them? The guilds began calculating potential revenue streams before they had even seen a human costume in person. The monuments of Tau offered no comment. They rarely did. But other species responded with curiosity. The Sown people were particularly interested. Their crystalline forms could not be easily covered or disguised, but the concept of temporary transformation intrigued them. Several researchers began experimenting with external housings that could change their appearance. The first costume ball was held 6 cycles after the Bureau's report was published. It was a modest affair by human standards. Only 47 attended, gathering in a specially constructed chamber on there. Each had created an external housing that altered their appearance in some way. Some had built structures that made them appear organic, with soft curves and muted colors. Others had created housings that mimicked other crystalline species. One particularly adventurous individual had constructed a housing that made them look like a human. Attended as an observer and was surprised by what they felt. Watching their fellow transform themselves, even temporarily, even artificially, created a strange sensation in their crystalline matrix. It was like seeing their species with new eyes. These beings they had known for centuries suddenly seemed different, more complex, more capable of surprise. The practice spread. The Eye, despite their initial dismissal, were among the next to experiment. Their festival of deep light had always involved bioluminescent displays, but now some younger eye began incorporating what they called historical bioluminescence reenactments. They would alter their light patterns to match those of ancient eye figures, pretending to be heroes and leaders from their species' distant past. The elders objected, of course. They called the practice disrespectful, a mockery of tradition. But the younger eye persisted. They found joy in pretending to be their ancestors, in imagining what it might have felt like to live in those ancient times. The practice did not replace the traditional festival of deep light. It simply added to it. Even the monuments of Tao eventually responded to the trend. Their celebrations had always been internal, a matter of existing more intensely rather than doing anything in particular. But some younger monuments began experimenting with what they called existing as another. They would temporarily reshape their mineral forms to resemble different geological formations, or even to approximate the shapes of organic species. The practice was slow and subtle by the standards of other species. A monument might spend an entire cycle gradually shifting their form to resemble a mountain range from a distant world. But for beings who measured time in geological eras, this was practically spontaneous. It was as close to a costume party as silicon-based life could achieve. Documented all of these developments. The Universal Celebration Index was being updated with entries for each new variation of transformative identity celebration. What had been a single entry crediting humanity, with inventing the category was expanding into dozens of sub-entries, describing how other species were adapting the practice to their own capabilities and cultures. 3 cycles after the original report, the first costume convention was held on Harmony 7, a neutral station that served as a meeting point for species from across the galaxy. The organizing committee included representatives from 23 species, all of whom had adopted some form of costume celebration in the preceding years. Was invited as a guest of honor. They arrived to find Harmony 7 transformed into something they could never have imagined. The station's corridors were filled with beings of every description, most of whom were pretending to be something other than themselves. A group of Eye had traveled from their deep oceans wearing environmental suits that had been decorated to look like human clothing. Their bioluminescent patterns spelled out words in various galactic languages. Hello, read one. Fear me, read another, presumably as a joke. Merchants from had come dressed as members of other species trading guilds, complete with fake cargo manifests and exaggerated accounting gestures. They wandered through the station pretending to make deals with each other, laughing at their own performances. A delegation floated through the crowds in elaborate housings that made them look like organic beings. Their crystalline cores were hidden beneath shells of plastic and fabric, giving them the appearance of soft, warm creatures that bled and breathed and aged. And everywhere there were humans, humans dressed as aliens, humans dressed as robots, humans dressed as fictional characters from their own entertainment media, humans dressed as fictional characters from other species' entertainment media, humans dressed as historical figures, both human and alien. One human approached with obvious excitement. She was dressed as a crystalline, wearing a costume that was remarkably accurate compared to the crude attempt had observed at that first Halloween party years ago. The costume's lights blinked in patterns that actually conveyed simple messages in the light language. I've been studying your species for years, the human explained. I wanted to understand what it feels like to communicate through light instead of sound. This costume doesn't really let me experience that, but it helps me imagine it. Standing next to her was an actual, wearing an elaborate housing that made them appear human. They had constructed a face from flexible materials, with mechanisms that allowed it to smile and frown. They had built a wig of fiber optic strands that approximated human hair. They had even added devices that simulated human breathing. I wanted to understand what it feels like to have a face, they said. Humans express so much through their faces. We express ourselves through light, which you cannot see the way we do. This costume helps me imagine what I would be if I had evolved differently." The human and the looked at each other across the gap between their species. For a moment, they were not quite human and not quite. They were something in between, something new, something that could only exist because they had both chosen to pretend to be something other than themselves. Recorded the moment and felt something shifting in their crystalline matrix. It was not quite an emotion, but it was something close. A recognition, perhaps, an understanding of why humanity's invention had spread so quickly and so far. Costume parties were not just about individual transformation. They were about connection. When a human dressed as an alien, they were reaching across the vastness of space to say, "I want to understand you. I want to imagine what it might feel like to be you. I want to find the common ground between us." And when an alien dressed as a human, they were saying the same thing. The convention continued for 3 days. Attended panels where beings from different species discussed their experiences with costume celebrations. They visited exhibition halls where artists displayed their most elaborate costume creations. They watched performances where beings acted out scenes from stories that had never been told before, stories that crossed species boundaries and imagined new possibilities. On the final day, found themselves in a corner of the station where someone had organized an impromptu contest. The theme was "Dress as Your Favorite Bureaucrat." It was meant as a joke, poking fun at the administrative machinery of galactic civilization. To their surprise, saw several beings dressed as Cultural Documentation Bureau archivists. Their costumes included crystalline elements and light projection devices that mimicked forms. They carried fake documentation devices and pretended to record everything they saw. One of them approached and performed an exaggerated imitation of an observation protocol, flickering their lights in patterns that were almost correct. "Am I doing it right?" they asked, their translated voice carrying a tone of genuine interest beneath the humor. Considered the question seriously. "Your light patterns are slightly off," they said, "but your attention to detail is impressive. You have captured something essential about what we do." The being in the costume seemed pleased. "I've always admired the Bureau's work," they admitted. "You travel the galaxy documenting how everyone celebrates. You help us understand each other. That seemed worth celebrating too." Had never thought of their work that way. They had always viewed documentation as a duty, a necessary task for preserving cultural knowledge, but this being saw it as something more, something worth honoring, something worth pretending to be. The archivist returned to the documentation station after the convention ended. They had thousands of hours of recordings to process, dozens of new entries to add to the index, reports to file and analyses to complete. But first, they updated the primary entry for transformative identity celebration. The original definition was no longer sufficient. Humanity had not merely invented a new form of celebration. They had invented a new way for the galaxy to connect with itself. The updated entry read, "Transformative identity celebration is a form of festivity in which participants temporarily adopt alternate identities, personas, or aesthetic presentations. Originally invented by humans of Earth, the practice has spread to numerous species across the known galaxy. Its psychological implications continue to reshape galactic recreational culture. The practice appears to fulfill a deep need for connection across boundaries of species, culture, and individual experience. By pretending to be something other than themselves, beings discover new truths about who they are." Added a final note, one that would be visible only to future archivists who access the complete file. Index rating, unprecedented. They saved the entry and floated toward the window of their office. Outside, the stars stretched across the darkness, each one potentially hosting worlds full of beings who were learning, even now, to imagine themselves differently. On one of those worlds, a human child was probably putting on a costume at this very moment, pretending to be a hero or a monster or an alien from a distant star, not knowing that their species had given the entire galaxy a gift. A simple gift, really. The gift of pretending, the gift of imagination, the gift of becoming, for just a little while, something more than oneself.